The river was raging, and no man had the courage to cross it. But he did. Nathaniel Brooks had always been a man of few words. His life on the isolated ranch was simple, free from the complications of the outside world. The wind howled through the desolate plains, and the only company he kept were his cattle and the occasional wild animal that dared to wander too close. But today, everything changed. As Nate made his way through the dense fog, the sound of a desperate cry cut through the wind. He paused, his hand tightening around the reins of his horse. It wasn't just the wind howling. Someone, or something, was in trouble. Without thinking, he spurred his horse toward the sound. It wasn't the first time he had heard a cry for help, but something in this call was different. It felt urgent, raw, filled with fear. As he neared the river, Nate saw them. Two figures, struggling against the current, desperately trying to keep their heads above water. Their cries were drowned by the roar of the river, but Nate could see their struggle clearly. The younger of the two, a boy no older than 16, was caught in the river's powerful current, his body being dragged further from the shore. The older man, his brother, was trying with all his might to reach him, but the water was too strong, and the boy's body was beginning to give way to the pressure. Without hesitation, Nate kicked his horse into a gallop. He had only one thought in mind: get them out. As the horse thundered down the banks of the river, Nate saw the two brothers, their faces strained with exhaustion and fear. The younger one was slipping, his body starting to disappear beneath the water. Nate could feel his heart race as he reached the river's edge, knowing he had only seconds to act. With a determined grunt, he leaped off his horse, his boots sinking into the muddy earth. He reached for the boy, his hands gripping the fabric of his soaked clothes. For a moment, the boy's dark eyes met his, filled with terror and disbelief. But there was no time for hesitation. Nate pulled with all his strength, hauling the boy from the current's grip. The older brother, his face etched with relief, grabbed Nate's arm, and together they hauled the boy to safety. The three of them collapsed on the riverbank, breathless and soaked, the boy coughing up water as he struggled to regain his breath. Nate watched as the two brothers, their faces painted with exhaustion, exchanged a glance. They didn't speak, but Nate could see the gratitude in their eyes. It was the kind of look that didn't need words. They knew what he had done for them, and they would never forget it. After a few moments, the older brother, still panting, stood up and offered Nate a hand. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice heavy with meaning. Nate nodded, but said nothing in return. He wasn't one for speeches. The brothers helped each other to their feet, the younger one still coughing, and they made their way toward the treeline. Nate watched them go, feeling the weight of the moment settle in. They were Apache, but that didn't matter. They were people, just like him. He had done what any man would have done. He helped them, no questions asked. As the brothers disappeared into the woods, Nate stood alone at the riverbank, the sound of the current still ringing in his ears. It wasn't over, though. He knew that. Something in the air told him that the path he had just stepped onto was far from finished. And as the sun began to set, Nate felt a stirring in his chest, a sense of destiny. He had no idea then, but the story of the two brothers, and his small act of kindness, was far from over. Years later, one of them would return. And when he did, it would change everything. I heard the thunder of hooves before I saw them. Nate Brooks stood at the edge of his porch, the wind biting at his skin as he scanned the horizon. It had been years since that fateful day by the river. Years since the two brothers, Kai and Talon Redfeather, had disappeared into the wilderness. But Nate never forgot. No one could ever forget the bond that was formed in that moment, the unspoken promise between them. As the dust cloud grew closer, Nate's heart began to race. He wasn't sure why, but he knew. This was no ordinary rider. This was something more. The rider emerged from the haze, his horse moving with a purpose. The figure was tall, dressed in a uniform that shimmered in the sunlight. A soldier's uniform. Nate's breath caught in his throat as the rider drew closer. He knew that face. Kai Redfeather, the boy he had pulled from the river all those years ago, now a man, a warrior in his own right. But this wasn't the same boy he remembered. This was someone else entirely. Kai's eyes, once filled with fear and gratitude, were now hard, focused, like a man who had seen too much, done too much. He pulled his horse to a stop in front of Nate's ranch, dismounting with the ease of a soldier. As he stood there, Nate couldn't help but notice how much he had changed. His once tattered clothes had been replaced by a polished uniform, adorned with insignia that marked him as someone of importance. The wind caught the edge of his coat, and for a moment, Nate could almost see the boy he had saved all those years ago. But it was fleeting. The soldier before him was a stranger in some ways. "It's been a long time, Nate," Kai said, his voice deep and steady, carrying the weight of years Nate couldn't begin to fathom. Nate nodded slowly, his throat tight. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words didn't come. He had so many questions, but none of them seemed right. Instead, he simply stepped forward and extended his hand. "Kai," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've changed." Kai looked down at the hand Nate offered and then back up at him. For a moment, there was something unreadable in his gaze, but it softened. "You saved my life," Kai said, his voice low. "I didn't forget that. I could never forget it." Nate felt a weight settle in his chest. He had known it was coming, but to hear it from Kai's lips was something else entirely. The years between them seemed to vanish in that one moment, and for a brief second, it was as if no time had passed at all. But then, the reality of the situation came crashing back. "What brings you here, soldier?" Nate asked, his voice hoarse. Kai straightened, his expression hardening once more. "I'm here because of a debt," he said. "One that was owed long before I became who I am now. The Apache people never forget their debts." Nate's brow furrowed. "A debt?" Kai nodded, his gaze steady. "Yes, you saved my life, but it wasn't just me you saved that day. You saved my family, my tribe. And now, I'm here to return that favor. It's time for me to repay the kindness you showed me." Nate's heart skipped a beat. The idea of someone repaying him, of a life coming full circle, was overwhelming. But it wasn't just the debt Kai spoke of. There was something else in his voice, something that made Nate wonder if the return of this man, this soldier, was more than just an act of gratitude. It felt like fate. The wind shifted, and for a moment, it felt as though the land itself was holding its breath. Kai stood tall, his back straight, his eyes fixed on Nate. There was no fear in them now, no doubt. Just a quiet, undeniable strength. "You've done your part, Nate," Kai said softly. "Now let me do mine." The words lingered in the air, heavy with meaning. Nate didn't know what the future held, but standing here, in this moment, he felt something shift. Something deep inside him that he hadn't realized was there. The quiet cowboy from the plains, the man who had once been so alone, now stood before a hero, a soldier who had returned not just to thank him, but to make things right. And whatever came next, Nate knew it would change everything. Ironically, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, the vast plains seemed to hold their breath. The wind, which had been relentless all afternoon, calmed as if waiting for something, or someone, to step forward. Kai Redfeather stood by the fence, his eyes fixed on the horizon. His uniform, now worn and weathered, was a sharp contrast to the man he had been all those years ago. He had returned as a soldier, a man of duty and honor, yet the weight of what had brought him back was still heavy on his chest. Nate stood a few feet away, his heart still trying to catch up with the past few moments. They had spoken of many things since their initial greeting, but Nate could sense there was more to Kai's visit than simple gratitude. The tension in the air was thick, and Nate knew that it was just a matter of time before the real reason for Kai's return would surface. "You're a long way from home, Kai," Nate said quietly, trying to break the silence that had fallen between them. Kai turned slowly, his gaze meeting Nate's with an intensity that spoke volumes. "My home is here now," he said. "I've been to many places, seen many things, but nothing feels like the land where I was saved." His words hung in the air, and Nate's heart skipped a beat. He had never expected to hear those words, not after all the years that had passed. The cowboy, who had once been a man of solitude, had become the symbol of something much greater, something far beyond the life he had once known. "You've been through a lot," Nate said, his voice steady but filled with understanding. "I can see it in your eyes. But what is it that brought you back here, to this place, after all this time?" Kai took a deep breath, the weight of his next words pressing down on him. "It's time to repay a debt," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not just to you, Nate, but to everyone who has ever helped me." Nate frowned, confusion flickering in his eyes. "A debt? I saved your life. I never expected anything in return." Kai shook his head, the faintest trace of a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. That's the thing, Nate. You didn't just save my life. You saved my soul. You gave me something I never had before, hope. And now, it's my turn to give that back, not just to you, but to the people who need it most. Nate was silent for a long moment, processing the gravity of Kai's words. He had always been a man of action, never one for grand speeches or promises. But standing here, in the fading light of day, he understood that this moment, this encounter, was something far more profound than he had realized. You don't owe me anything, Kai, Nate said, his voice thick with emotion. I did what anyone would have done. But if there's something I can do to help you now, you know I'll do it. Kai nodded, his expression hardening once more as he straightened, the weight of his uniform feeling heavier than ever. There are things coming, Nate. Things that are bigger than both of us. I've seen the darkness that's creeping into the world. I've seen what people are capable of when they lose sight of what really matters. Nate took a step forward, his hand resting on the weathered wood of the fence, his gaze never leaving Kai's face. What are you asking for? Kai's eyes darkened as he met Nate's gaze. I need you to help me protect this land. This is where it all began, where everything changed. And now, it's time for us to stand together. It's time for us to show the world what real strength looks like. The silence that followed was deafening. Nate knew the moment had arrived. This was the choice he had been waiting for, the choice that would define the rest of his life. He had always prided himself on being a man of the land, a man who could rely on no one but himself. But Kai had returned, and with him came the realization that the world was changing, and the choices they made today would shape the future for everyone who lived on this land. I'm with you, Kai, Nate said finally, his voice strong and resolute. Whatever comes next, we face it together. The wind picked up again, but this time it didn't feel as cold. It felt like a promise that Nate and Kai would face the challenges ahead, not as strangers, but as brothers. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the mountains, the two men stood side by side, knowing that whatever the future held, they were ready to face it, together. The days that followed felt like a dream, a shift in the very air around Nate's ranch. The wind, though still harsh, carried a different weight, as if the land itself had shifted. The rhythm of daily life was the same, chopping wood, tending to the animals, but there was an undercurrent of something more. Nate couldn't shake the feeling that change was coming, and it wasn't the kind of change he could control. Kai had returned, not just to thank him, but to warn him. The conversation had lingered in Nate's mind, the weight of it settling in. They were going to face something bigger than either of them could imagine, and as much as Nate had prided himself on being self-sufficient, he knew that he couldn't face this alone. One evening, after the sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues, Nate found himself standing at the edge of his property. The air was cooler now, and the sounds of the evening settled around him. As he gazed out across the land, he saw a figure approaching. It was Kai, walking steadily toward him, his steps firm, his face unreadable. There was something different about him tonight, something more intense. The soldier in Kai seemed to have taken over completely. The time is near, Kai said, his voice low but steady. Things are moving faster than I thought. The people who would see this land fall into chaos aren't far behind. Nate turned to face him, his brow furrowed. What exactly are we up against? Kai's gaze didn't waver, his eyes cold with a resolve that Nate hadn't seen before. There are forces at play, Nate. People with power, people with the kind of influence that can move mountains. They want to take this land, our land. And they'll stop at nothing to do it. But it's not just the land. It's the spirit of it. It's what this place represents. Nate felt a tightening in his chest. He had always known that the land he loved so much was coveted by others. He had heard whispers of the government's interest in the land, the railroad companies that sought to expand their reach. But this was different. The way Kai spoke, it was as if he wasn't just talking about land or power. He was talking about something deeper, something that connected them all to the earth in a way that couldn't be measured in acres or dollars. What can we do? Nate asked, his voice steady but filled with uncertainty. Kai looked at him then, his eyes softening, though his stance remained resolute. We protect what's ours. Not just the land, but the people. The ones who have lived here for generations. The ones who rely on this place for survival. We stand together. It's the only way. Nate felt a surge of something deep within him. He had always lived a solitary life, keeping to himself, believing that he was enough. But in that moment, standing beside Kai, he realized that the fight ahead was not just about one man or one ranch. It was about something greater. It was about a community, about standing up for what was right, even when the odds seemed impossible. "All right," Nate said, his voice quiet but firm. "I'm with you. Whatever comes next, we face it together." Kai gave a small nod, the faintest smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "I knew you would be." The two men stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their pact settling between them. The stars were beginning to appear in the sky, scattered across the darkening expanse above them. It was a peaceful sight, but it didn't fool Nate. He knew that peace, like everything else, was fragile, and the storm that was coming would test them all. As the night deepened, Nate turned back toward his cabin, his mind racing with thoughts of the future. He had always believed in the land, in its power to shape and define the lives of those who worked it. But now, as he walked beside Kai, he realized that it was the people who mattered most. And together, they would defend what was theirs, no matter the cost. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. The calm of the plains was a deceptive mask, hiding the storm that was slowly building. Nate worked harder than ever, his mind occupied with the looming threat that Kai had spoken of. Though they had prepared as best they could, there was a sense of unease that lingered in the air, a tension that Nate couldn't shake. Every time he passed the edge of the property, he caught glimpses of Kai, standing tall, his uniform sharp against the backdrop of the wilderness. But today, something felt different. The air was thick with the promise of change, and Nate could feel it in his bones. The sound of hooves echoed in the distance, drawing his attention. He turned, his eyes scanning the horizon. It wasn't just the wind today. It was the movement of something larger, something that carried with it the weight of what was to come. Kai had told him that the forces they were up against were already on the move. And now, Nate could see it for himself. A group of riders appeared in the distance, their forms slowly becoming clearer. They moved with purpose, their pace steady and deliberate. Nate felt a knot tighten in his stomach. These weren't just travelers passing through. No, this was something else. As the riders drew closer, Nate could make out the distinctive colors of the uniform, the telltale sign of the military. But this was not the local army. This was something else entirely. Kai stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his sidearm, his expression hardening. "They're here," he said quietly, his voice a low growl. Nate nodded, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle slung across his back. The two men stood side by side, their eyes locked on the approaching riders. There was no turning back now. This was it, the moment they had both been preparing for. As the riders came closer, Nate could feel the tension in the air intensify. There were a dozen of them, their faces set in grim determination. The lead rider pulled up in front of them, his eyes narrowing as he studied Nate and Kai. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the wind, the silence stretching between them like a living thing. Finally, the rider spoke. "This land belongs to the government now. You've had your time, but it's over. Step aside, and we'll make this easy." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Nate felt a surge of anger rise within him. He had known this day would come, but hearing it spoken aloud made it all the more real. Kai's jaw tightened, his eyes burning with intensity. "This land is not yours to take," he said, his voice cold and firm. The rider sneered, his eyes flicking to Kai. "You think you can stop us?" he asked, his tone mocking. "You and what army?" Kai's gaze never wavered. "We don't need an army," he said. "We have something more powerful." For a moment, there was a flicker of uncertainty in the rider's eyes, but it quickly disappeared, replaced by the cold, unfeeling stare of someone who had long ago given up on humanity. "This is your last chance," the rider said, his voice hard. "Move aside, or we'll take it by force." Kai didn't flinch. He stood tall, his posture unwavering. "We will not move," he said, his voice calm, but full of conviction. Nate stood beside him, his grip tightening on his rifle. He wasn't sure what was going to happen next, but he knew one thing for certain. They were not going to let anyone take what was theirs. The wind picked up, swirling around them, but for the first time in days, Nate felt a sense of clarity. The storm was coming, but they were ready. Together, they would face whatever came next, and they would stand their ground. The standoff continued, the silence stretching between them like an unspoken challenge. The wind howled across the plains, but for Nate, everything was still, as if the world had stopped moving. The rider's words hung in the air, thick with the weight of authority, but Nate could feel something shift inside him. This was no longer just about defending his land. It was about something deeper, about standing up for the people, for the life that had grown here, that had flourished in the dust and the sun. Kai stood beside him, unflinching, his posture strong, but Nate could see the same fire burning in his eyes. The rider on the horse shifted slightly, waiting for their response. He was used to people backing down, to people bending to the will of the government or the army. But Kai's resolve didn't waver. "You don't understand," Kai said calmly, his voice carrying the weight of everything he had fought for. "This land isn't just land. It's part of who we are. It's part of our story, our future. You can't just take it." The rider scoffed, his expression twisting in disbelief. "And what makes you think you can stop us? This is bigger than you, bigger than your little ranch. This is about the future of the nation." Kai's eyes narrowed, but he remained calm. "The future of the nation?" he repeated, his voice sharp. "What about the future of the people who have lived here, who have bled for this land, who have fought to preserve it? The future isn't just about power and politics. It's about the people who live and breathe in this land." Nate's heart quickened as he listened. There was so much truth in what Kai was saying. This wasn't just a battle over land. It was a battle for the very soul of the West. The rider's face hardened. "You've made your choice then," he said, his voice cold, dismissing them as if they were nothing. "We'll see how long your resolve lasts when the consequences arrive." With a snap of his reins, the rider turned his horse, signaling for the others to follow. Nate and Kai stood together, watching as they rode off, their silhouettes disappearing into the distance. For a moment, everything was still again, the tension dissipating with the wind. But Nate knew this wasn't over. The words of the rider echoed in his mind. Consequences. It was a promise, and Nate wasn't sure what it meant, but he could feel it coming. Kai exhaled slowly, his hand dropping from the hilt of his sidearm. "This isn't just about us anymore," he said, his voice quieter now. "It's about everyone. About the land, the people, and the history we've all built together. We've made our stand." Nate nodded, his heart heavy with the weight of what was to come. "And we'll protect it," he said firmly. Together. The sky above began to darken, the first stars appearing in the twilight. There was a sense of finality in the air, as though the earth itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next chapter to unfold. Nate knew that whatever came next, it would test them both. But as he stood there beside Kai, he realized something. They weren't alone. The land, the people, the life they had fought for, everything that made this place home, was with them. And together, they would face whatever came their way. Days passed, and the tension in the air only grew heavier. Nate couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something that would test them all. It had been weeks since the military riders had left, but their words still echoed in his mind, as though they were carved into the very land he called home. "We'll see how long your resolve lasts when the consequences arrive." Nate stood at the edge of his porch, his gaze scanning the horizon as the wind picked up. The land stretched out before him, vast and unforgiving, but it was his. He had fought for it, and he wasn't about to let it go. Kai stood beside him, his expression unreadable as always. The soldier in him never faltered, but Nate could tell that even Kai was feeling the weight of the situation. "They'll be back," Kai said quietly, his voice low and steady, as though he had already accepted the inevitable. "And when they do, we'll be ready." Nate nodded, his hand resting on the rifle slung across his back. "I don't know what's coming, but I know this land isn't just ours to protect. It's for everyone who's called this place home, and I won't let anyone take that from us." The two men stood in silence, the only sound the distant call of birds overhead and the rustling of the dry grass at their feet. Nate had always been a man of action, but even he knew that the battle ahead wouldn't be fought with rifles alone. It would take something more. "We need to rally the others," Nate said, breaking the silence. "The people around here, the ones who care about this land. If we're going to face whatever comes, we can't do it alone." Kai glanced at him, a slight nod of agreement. "I've been talking to the others. We'll have support when the time comes. But you're right. We need to show them that we stand together, that this land is worth fighting for." Nate looked out over the plains, his thoughts drifting back to the day he had first arrived here, so many years ago. He had come looking for peace, for solitude, and had found a life he never expected. But now, that life was under threat, and he couldn't stand by and watch it slip away. "We'll fight for it," Nate said, his voice firm. "And we'll make sure the world knows that this land isn't for the taking. It's ours, and we'll defend it." The sun began to dip low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the land. Nate turned and started walking toward the barn, his thoughts focused on the work that still needed to be done. But in the back of his mind, he couldn't help but wonder what the next few days would bring. The storm that had been brewing for so long was finally approaching, and when it came, it would change everything. Kai followed him, his footsteps heavy but purposeful. "We'll need to prepare," Kai said, his voice calm but resolute. "There's no telling how far they'll go to take what they want. But we've got something they don't." Nate glanced at him, a question in his eyes. "What's that?" Kai met his gaze, his expression unwavering. "We've got each other," he said simply. Nate's chest tightened, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to feel the weight of what they were up against. It wasn't just about protecting the land. It was about protecting the people, the ones who had stood by him through everything. And together, they would face whatever was coming. Nate didn't know what the future held, but one thing was clear: they weren't going to back down. The fight for this land was far from over, and they would give everything to defend it. The sun rose the next morning, casting its golden light over the rugged plains, but the feeling in the air was different. There was a sense of anticipation, a quiet before the storm. Nate stood by the barn, his hand resting on the fence as he watched the horizon, his mind racing. He had always loved the mornings, the peaceful stillness, but today it felt like something was waiting just beyond the edge of the world. Kai stood beside him, silent as always, but there was a tension in his posture, a readiness that was impossible to ignore. "It's coming," Kai said quietly, his eyes fixed on the distant hills. Nate nodded, his thoughts heavy. "We'll be ready," he said, though he wasn't sure if that was enough. They had gathered everyone they could, but in the back of his mind, Nate wondered if they were truly prepared for what was coming. The riders, the ones who had threatened them, were just the beginning. They had the support of the people around them, but the forces they were up against were far larger than anything they had ever faced. "I don't know how long we can hold on," Nate admitted, his voice rough. "But we have to try." Kai glanced at him, his expression unreadable. "It's not about holding on," he said. "It's about standing tall, no matter what." Nate turned to face him, his brow furrowed. "You really think we can win this?" Kai met his gaze, his eyes steady. "We can't lose," he said simply. "Not when it means everything we've fought for." Nate took a deep breath, trying to steady the storm of thoughts in his mind. They weren't just fighting for land or cattle. They were fighting for the spirit of the West, for the way of life that had defined them. And that was something worth fighting for. The day passed in a blur of preparations. The men and women of the town came together, each contributing what they could. They fortified the ranch, securing the perimeter, preparing for whatever might come. The mood was tense, but there was also a quiet determination. As evening fell, the wind picked up again, howling across the plains like an omen. The horizon seemed darker, the shadows longer, and for a moment, Nate felt a chill run down his spine. He wasn't sure if it was the storm or something else. Kai stood beside him, his expression unreadable as he watched the sky. "They'll come at night," Kai said, his voice low. "They think we're weak. They think we'll back down. But they don't know what we're made of." Nate nodded, his jaw tight. "We won't back down," he said. He had no idea what the next few hours would bring, but one thing was certain: they weren't going to surrender. They stood together, side by side, the weight of what was to come hanging in the air. The wind continued to howl, carrying with it a sense of inevitability. They were ready. Whatever came next, they would face it together. As the stars began to appear in the sky, Nate took one last look at the land around him. This was home, and he would do whatever it took to protect it. The night stretched on, the sky above dark and endless, and the wind continued to howl, carrying the scent of dust and the promise of change. Nate stood by the window, watching the moon rise high above the plains, its pale light casting long shadows across the land. He could feel the weight of the night in his bones, a heaviness that was more than just the anticipation of what was to come. It was the feeling that something was already set in motion, and no matter how much they prepared, they couldn't stop what was coming. Kai stood by the door, his posture still and alert, his eyes scanning the horizon as if he could see through the night itself. "They'll be here soon," Kai said quietly, his voice steady, but there was something in the tone that spoke of the inevitability of what was about to unfold. Nate nodded, though he didn't speak. There was nothing more to say. They had prepared as best as they could, and now all they could do was wait. The sound of horses' hooves reached them first, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing second. Nate's heart pounded in his chest as he gripped the rifle in his hands, feeling the weight of it as though it were a part of him. It wasn't the rifle that gave him strength, though. It was the knowledge that they weren't alone. The people of the land, the ones who had always called this place home, were with them. They had rallied, ready to stand their ground. As the riders drew closer, Nate felt a surge of resolve. He wasn't afraid. He had seen too much, lost too much, to turn back now. He glanced at Kai, who nodded silently in return. They would face this together. The riders appeared from the shadows, their figures slowly taking shape in the moonlight. They weren't alone, Nate could see that. There were dozens of them, more than he had expected. But the one leading the group was unmistakable. The same rider who had spoken to them weeks ago, his cold eyes gleaming with the arrogance of someone who believed they had already won. "This is it," Kai said, stepping forward. Nate followed his lead, his boots thudding softly against the earth as he moved toward the door. The air was thick with tension, but there was something else too, something more. It was the weight of history, of everything that had come before them, and everything that would come after. They were standing on the edge of something much bigger than just a fight for land. It was a fight for what was right. The rider stopped in front of the ranch, his horse stamping impatiently beneath him. "You've had your chance," the rider called out, his voice carrying over the distance, cold and final. "Step aside, and we'll make this painless. Don't make this harder than it has to be." Nate stepped forward, his voice steady as he called back, "This land doesn't belong to you. It never will." The rider's expression twisted into a sneer. "You're wrong," he said, his voice sharp. "This land belongs to whoever takes it." Kai stepped forward then, standing tall beside Nate. "It belongs to the people who've worked it, bled for it, and died for it. Not to men like you, who think you can take whatever you want." There was a long silence. The riders shifted in their saddles, their eyes scanning the two men before them. Nate held his ground, the weight of the moment pressing down on him, but he didn't move. He couldn't. Kai stood beside him, unwavering, his gaze fixed on the rider. "We're not backing down," Kai said, his voice calm but filled with undeniable strength. The rider's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Nate thought he saw a flicker of uncertainty. But then, the rider straightened, his lips curling into a cruel smile. "So be it," he said. The sound of hooves echoed in the distance as the rider turned his horse, signaling his men to follow. Nate and Kai stood together, watching them retreat into the night. The wind howled again, but this time, it felt different. There was a sense of resolve in the air, a quiet understanding that the storm was far from over. But they had made their stand, and they would fight until the very end. The days that followed felt like an uneasy calm. The riders had retreated, but the tension in the air remained thick. Nate spent his time patrolling the land, making sure that every fence was intact, every gate closed, and every shadow watched. He could feel the weight of the silence, the sense that something was about to break. Kai had gathered the people, the families who lived nearby, to fortify their defenses. But there was more to it than just preparing for an attack. They were uniting, creating something stronger than any wall or rifle. It was a sense of community that Nate hadn't felt in years. As he stood on the porch, watching the sky shift from dusk to night, he thought about what the rider had said, about how things were never really over, how the fight was far from done. He turned his attention back to the land, the only place he had ever truly known. The wind kicked up again, but this time it felt different. It wasn't the same howling gusts that he had grown used to. It felt like a warning, a shift. He wasn't the only one who felt it. Kai walked up behind him, his footsteps heavy on the dirt. "They're coming," Kai said simply, his voice calm, but with an edge that spoke of preparation. Nate didn't turn to look at him. He didn't need to. He already knew. "I know," Nate replied, his voice steady. "But we'll be ready." Kai nodded, his gaze sweeping over the land. We've done everything we can, he said. It's not just about the fight. It's about what we stand for. This land, these people, our people, they deserve more than to be trampled on. Nate felt something shift inside him. He had always been a man of few words, content with the quiet rhythm of his work and the solitude that came with it. But standing here, with Kai beside him and the land stretching out before him, he realized that what they were about to face was bigger than him, bigger than anyone. It was about something far deeper than just land. It was about belonging. The distant sound of hooves echoed again, closer this time. Nate's hand instinctively went to the rifle at his side, but he didn't move. They had done what they could. Now, it was up to the land and the people to hold strong. Kai stepped forward, a calm determination in his every move. They think they can break us, he said softly, his voice steady. But they don't understand what this place means. Nate glanced at him, their eyes locking in an unspoken understanding. They'll learn soon enough, Nate said. Together, they walked toward the barn, where the others had gathered. The people they had rallied were ready. They were united in a way that couldn't be broken. The riders had underestimated them before. But now, there was no question. They would face whatever came next with everything they had, and they would stand tall. They weren't just defending a piece of land. They were defending a way of life. Nate felt that truth settle in his chest. And no matter what happened, he knew they wouldn't back down. Not this time. As the first rider came into view, the air felt heavier, thicker with the weight of what was to come. But Nate stood firm, and beside him, Kai did the same. They had fought for this land before, and they would do it again. The riders approached, their figures casting long shadows in the fading light. Nate and Kai stood side by side, their eyes fixed on the horizon. The air was thick with tension, but neither man moved. The sound of hooves grew louder, each step carrying with it the weight of what was coming. As the riders drew closer, Nate's grip tightened on his rifle. He could see the leader at the front, the same man who had threatened them weeks ago. His cold eyes met Nate's across the distance, but there was no fear in them. Only the certainty of someone who believed they had already won. It's time, Kai said quietly, his voice steady. Nate nodded, his jaw set. We're not backing down, he said, his voice low but firm. The riders stopped in front of them, the leader dismounting with a practiced ease. He wasn't alone, and behind him were others, their faces hard and determined. The wind picked up, swirling around them as if urging them to act. I see you've gathered your people, the rider said, his voice carrying over the wind. But it won't matter. This land is ours now. It's only a matter of time before you see it. Kai stepped forward, his eyes never leaving the rider's face. You don't own this land. It doesn't belong to you, and it never will. The rider sneered, his gaze flicking to the other men behind him. You think you can stop us? We have the law on our side. And soon, we'll have the army too. Nate felt his pulse quicken, but he didn't let it show. He was used to threats, used to people believing that they could take what they wanted. But this land wasn't just a piece of property. It was home. The law doesn't mean anything if it goes against what's right, Nate said, his voice unwavering. The rider's expression twisted with anger, but he didn't respond. Instead, he turned to his men. Prepare yourselves, he said, his voice cold and commanding. The riders began to move, positioning themselves around the two men, but Kai and Nate didn't flinch. They were ready. The tension in the air was thick, but there was something else too. A quiet strength, a certainty that no matter how many riders came, they wouldn't back down. Kai's voice cut through the silence. We've worked this land. We've lived here. And we'll fight for it, no matter who comes against us. The leader of the riders paused, his eyes narrowing as if assessing the two men before him. You think you're the only ones who've fought for something? He asked, his tone mocking. We've all had to fight, but in the end, it's the strongest who survive. Strength isn't measured by who has the most power, Kai replied. It's measured by what you're willing to fight for. The rider said nothing for a long moment, his gaze flicking between Kai and Nate. Finally, he shook his head. You're fools, he said, his voice low with contempt. But I'll give you one last chance to walk away. Leave now, and you won't regret it. Nate met his gaze without hesitation. We're not going anywhere, he said firmly. The rider stared at them for a moment longer, then turned away, signaling for his men to follow. They began to move, but the threats still lingered in the air. The riders were leaving for now, but it was clear that the fight wasn't over. As the group disappeared into the distance, Nate and Kai stood together, their resolve unbroken. They had made their stand, and they wouldn't back down. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Nate could feel it deep inside. This was more than just a fight for land. It was a fight for everything they believed in. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, he knew one thing for certain. They would keep fighting. They would keep standing tall, no matter the odds. The days passed in a slow, steady march toward the unknown. Nate kept to his routines, but there was a restlessness in the air, an unease that had settled deep in his chest. The riders had left, but their words echoed in his mind, each promise of future conflict like a shadow creeping closer. Kai had remained by his side, coordinating with the families that had gathered in support, preparing for whatever might come. Yet, even with all the preparation, there was a quiet that threatened to break. It was early in the morning when it came. The sound of hooves, distant but growing louder with each passing second. Nate stood up from his work, wiping his hands on his pants as he glanced toward the horizon. There they were again, the same group of riders. But this time there was no mistaking their intent. They weren't retreating. They were advancing. Kai was at his side in an instant, his hand on the hilt of his sidearm. Nate could feel the tension rise, the air thick with the weight of what was to come. "They've returned," Nate said, his voice low but steady. Kai nodded, his eyes narrowing as he studied the riders. "It's time," Kai said simply, his voice full of resolve. Nate felt that same surge of determination course through him. They had made their stand. They weren't about to let it be taken away from them now. The riders slowed as they approached, their leader at the front, the same cold gaze that had met Nate's before. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of dust and anticipation. "You've had your chance," the rider called out, his voice carrying over the distance. "This is your last warning. Step aside, and we'll leave you in peace." The words hung in the air, thick with the promise of an ultimatum. Kai stepped forward, his presence commanding. "This is our land. We're not going anywhere," he said firmly. Nate stood beside him, his jaw set. "And we're not leaving. Not for you or anyone else." The rider's expression hardened, his eyes flicking to his men. There was a moment of silence, a tension so thick it felt like the very earth was holding its breath. "So be it," the rider finally said, his voice low and sharp. "You've made your choice." With that, the riders turned, their horses stomping as they began to circle. Nate's heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't flinch. Kai's steady gaze never wavered as he scanned the horizon, his mind calculating, assessing every movement. "We've prepared for this," Kai said, his voice calm and steady. "We stand our ground. No one takes what's ours." Nate nodded, his hand resting on the rifle at his side. He knew this was just the beginning, that the conflict was far from over, but he also knew that together, they could face whatever came next. They weren't alone. The people who had rallied to their side were there, just beyond the horizon, ready to defend their way of life. Nate could feel that unity in the air, a quiet strength that spoke louder than any threat. The riders circled once more, but this time, there was no fear in their eyes. They were testing them, trying to break their resolve. But Nate and Kai stood firm, their hearts aligned with the land they had fought for. The riders would learn soon enough. This was not a fight they could win. They would defend their home, their land, their people, no matter the cost. The battle wasn't just about land. It was about everything that had been built here, everything that had been fought for. And Nate wasn't going to let it be taken without a fight. The days following the riders' retreat were filled with preparation. Nate and Kai had managed to rally the people, and together, they fortified every weak spot in the land they held dear. There was a sense of urgency in the air, but there was also something else, a shared resolve. The families that had come together on this land weren't just neighbors. They were a united front, a force that could not be easily shaken. As the sun began to set one evening, casting a soft orange glow over the plains, Nate stood outside the barn, his eyes scanning the land. The wind had died down, leaving an almost unnatural stillness in its wake. Kai walked up beside him, his steps firm but silent. "We're ready," Kai said quietly, his gaze following Nate's as they both looked toward the horizon. Nate didn't say anything for a moment. He just nodded, his thoughts drifting back to the riders who had come before, their threats hanging in the air like a dark cloud. But the people who stood beside him weren't afraid. Not anymore. They'll come again, Nate said finally, his voice steady. But we won't be caught off guard. Kai nodded, his jaw set. No. We'll face them head on. But we won't be fighting just for ourselves. We're fighting for something bigger, something that belongs to everyone who's stood by this land. The weight of Kai's words settled deep in Nate's chest. It wasn't just about the land. It was about the way of life they had built here, about the people who had sacrificed to make this place a home. As the sun dipped lower, the silence stretched between them, the only sound the distant call of a bird flying high above. Kai's voice broke the quiet. The storm is coming, he said, his tone heavy. But we'll weather it. Together. Nate turned to him then, meeting his gaze. There was something in Kai's eyes that spoke of more than just the moment at hand. It was the knowledge that this wasn't just a battle. It was a test of everything they had fought for. We've got each other, Nate said, his voice low but full of conviction. And we won't let this place go without a fight. Kai's lips curved into the faintest of smiles, but it was a smile born of shared understanding. We never will. The night fell, and the two men stood side by side, watching the sky grow darker with each passing minute. The wind picked up again, carrying with it the first whispers of what was to come. But Nate didn't feel fear. He felt something stronger, a quiet, unshakable resolve. He wasn't alone. Kai wasn't alone. And the people who had gathered here, those who called this land home, weren't alone either. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The land would not fall. Not without a fight. As the stars began to fill the sky, Nate knew that the storm was coming. But they would face it with everything they had, and nothing would take what was theirs.